I want to thank Mike for inviting me. I want to thank everybody who invited me. Even understanding that I'm a pinch hitter, I'll try and at least hit a ground out or something like that instead of striking out. I want to first say that Gerard's book is very important on a number of different levels. First, it does help raise the profile of John Bingham, who's, as everyone knows, the Madison of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, except unlike Madison, he actually got what he wanted. The second thing is that with respect to the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, he's obviously correct in emphasizing the importance of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And the third thing is, in his discussion, again, the part that I'm going to focus on, because it's the part that I at least know a little bit about, he makes the very important point that Congress rejected the first draft, or the Congress in general rejected the first draft of the 14th Amendment, the congressional power draft, because it was too broad, because it would have been read as giving Congress too much power. And it seems to me that has important implications for a variety of different arguments, not only about congressional power, but about these broad arguments about, that's just broad conceptions about the 14th Amendment. John Bingham, in the 14th Amendment, John Bingham was this sort of airhead bozo who didn't understand anything about law. I think he makes a very important point that he did understand things about law. I'm not sure he would have been considered one of the greatest legal minds, but he certainly thought about things in a systematic way. That having been said, I want to say that I read the story of the rejection of the first draft, which is in the late 60s and early 70s in the book, differently than Gerard does. Gerard's reading is that the reason it was rejected was that Republicans were worried about the breadth of the Privileges and Immunities Clause. They were particularly worried about Corfield versus Coryell, and that maybe this change from and to or in the later draft is significant. Well, I want to take the last two first. I don't think that they were particularly worried about Corfield versus Coryell, because when Howard is presenting the later draft, the second draft as part of the comprehensive 14th Amendment, of which Section 1 was a part, he's all over Corfield versus Coryell and talking about the Privileges and Immunities Clause. He says, this is what it is, plus some other things. The second thing about the change from and to or, which I think may have been discussed in a few other places, is that if you think about it, that's a simple necessary grammatical correction. Because if you have power to enforce or to protect, you're protecting both privileges and immunities. But if you're worried about people infringing, you're worried about people infringing privileges or immunities. So that's the reason for that change. That's just a simple grammatical change. I think most important, however, is, at least as I read the evidence, the reason that the original draft was rejected, well, at least by Republicans, really, they didn't talk about the Privileges and Immunities Clause. In fact, there were, I think, 5 Republicans who made objections to the original draft. 4 Republicans, House Republicans from New York, and Senator William Stewart from Nevada, who just went off on it for reasons which, he just decided to go off on it. And with the exception of one who just made sort of a brief offhand comment, which was Roscoe Conkling, the complaints are very consistent. And the complaints are not that there is a problem with the Privileges and Immunities Clause, but rather that there was a problem with the equal protection of rights, life, liberty, and property. And that the concern was that it would give Congress power to basically have authority to regulate almost everything that had to do with life, liberty, and property, so long as they were equalized. Now those are the complaints of, it would be pompous to name names, so I won't. Of all the people who complained about it, I will name one name just because he's generally cited as the ultimate source by people who have the broad vision of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, and that's Giles Hotchkiss, who is the person who said that you shouldn't have just give power to enforce, that you should make it a direct prohibition because it's not radical enough, which leads to laughter from the body assembled. but basically they're complaining about the equal protection language, and that leads to an important change in the language, which is not at least directly referenced in the pages in the book, which is from equal protection of life, liberty, and property to equal protection of the laws. And this gets back, I think, to a point about the historical understanding and the availability of materials. That equal protection of life, liberty, and property is an open-ended concept in terms of congressional power, whereas equal protection of the laws, at least I know Christopher Green has talked about this, and I've even talked about it a little bit in a prior life, was a concept which had actually a technical legal meaning which was unclear at the margins, but certainly not open-ended. And so it's that change, which is a critical change in addition to the other changes, which appear that and Benjamin Wade's suggestion that you include a definition of citizenship in the Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which leads to, well, I can't say it led to Republican unanimity because that's a very complicated story having to do as much, probably more with other sections of the amendment than Section 1 itself, but rather what it did was there weren't any objections from Republicans. There was an objection from Reverdy Johnson, Democrat Reverdy Johnson, who was the most able Democratic lawyer in the Senate, who said he didn't understand what privileges or immunities were, but no complaints from Republicans when the 14th Amendment is ultimately adopted about Section 1. So that's my primary, that's my shtick, and I'm sticking to it. So that's about all I have to say. Want to hear about my kids? No. Then I'll sit down. Thank you.